You're standing in your kitchen, staring at a power bill that's climbed again, wondering how just living decently got this dear. You think the answer is more money, more credit, a bigger buffer. You've got it backwards, and it's costing you every single day. Here's what I now know for certain. For most of this country's history, ordinary Australian families lived well without a cent of debt, and in the ways that actually matter, they lived better than we do now. That's not a fairy tale. That knowledge came out of bush kitchens, off-station verandas, and out of the Country Women's Association halls, where the practical secrets got written down and handed on. And there's a document, tied to a dusty gold mining town in Western Australia in the 1890s, that proves the whole thing. It describes a simple thing a working family built on a bench that kept their food fresh for weeks without a single watt of power. I'll show you exactly how to make it before the end, and it works whether you're on 40 acres or in a rented flat with one window. I remember the moment it cracked open for me. I was standing in my late uncle's tin shed outside Dubbo, going through his gear after he passed, and I found a hessian-covered box sitting where I'd have put a bar fridge. I nearly threw it in the skip. I'm so glad I didn't, because that box taught me I'd wasted decades believing a lie. Let me tell you what the lie is, because you're living inside it right now, same as I was. The lie is that living well is something you buy. That comfort, good food, a warm home, a full pantry, that all of it flows out of your income and your capacity to borrow against tomorrow. We've been taught that the good life sits behind a paywall, and if you can't reach it, you top it up with credit and pay the interest as a kind of admission fee. I believed that for 40 years. I really did. I chased the raises. I signed the finance agreements. I told myself that the newer, faster, plugged-in version of everything was progress, and that the people who came before me simply put up with hardship because they had no choice. I pitied them, if I'm honest. I looked at old photos of families on the land, and I thought, poor buggers, imagine living like that. That pity was the most expensive feeling I've ever had, because when I actually started asking the older folks around me, the ones still alive who remembered, a completely different picture came out. My uncle's generation didn't feel poor. They felt capable. They ate better than most of us do, off food they controlled from soil to plate. They stayed warmer for less. They fixed instead of replaced. And when the whole economy fell off a cliff, they barely wobbled. Let's talk about that cliff, because the numbers stopped me cold. During the Great Depression here in Australia, unemployment climbed to around 30% by 1932. Think about that. Nearly 1 in 3 working men with no wage coming in. In America and Britain, that meant breadlines and desperation, on a scale we can hardly imagine. And yet across huge stretches of this country, families ate 3 meals a day right through it. How? Not because they had savings. Most had nothing. They ate because living well was never actually plugged into money for them in the first place. The garden didn't care about the stock market. The chooks laid whether the bank was open or not. The preserved fruit in the cupboard didn't check your bank balance before it fed your kids in July. That's the thing I want you to really sit with. The families who sailed through the worst financial disaster in living memory weren't the rich ones. They were the self-reliant ones, and self-reliance back then wasn't some hobby for eccentrics. It was just how a normal household ran. I found the proof of that in the founding of the Country Women's Association, formed in New South Wales in 1922. These weren't fringe survivalists. This was the largest women's organization in the country, and its entire purpose was to gather and pass on the practical know-how of running a household well on almost nothing. Their handbooks are extraordinary. Page after page of methods for keeping food, mending, growing, healing, and cooking that assumed you would produce most of what you needed yourself. I sat with one of those old handbooks for a whole afternoon, and I got angrier with every page, because I realized nobody ever taught me any of this. Not one bit of it, and it wasn't lost by accident. So here's the question that started keeping me up at night. If this knowledge was so good, If it let people live well and sleep soundly through a depression, where did it go? Why did my generation grow up believing the exact opposite, that the good life had to be bought and borrowed? That's where the story stops being a warm bit of nostalgia and starts making my blood boil. Because somebody profited from us forgetting. Think about it plainly. A family that grows a decent slice of its own food, keeps that food fresh without a mountain of appliances, mends its own clothes, and heats its home cleverly instead of expensively, that family is a terrible customer. They buy less. They borrow less. They don't need the newest thing every couple of years. From the point of view of anyone selling convenience, self-reliance is a disease, and it had to be cured. And it was cured, deliberately, over about 2 generations. After the Second World War, the whole engine of the economy shifted toward selling us things. The home stopped being a place that produced and became a place that consumed. A working household that once made and grew and preserved was slowly retrained to buy and plug in and throw away. Every skill your grandmother had was quietly repackaged and sold back to you as a product with a plug on it and a price tag attached. Take keeping food cold. Your grandmother had ways to keep meat and milk and butter fresh in the middle of an Australian summer without electricity. I'll get to exactly how, because it's the heart of what I want to give you today. But that knowledge got buried under one simple message repeated for 50 years. You need the fridge. You need the bigger fridge. You need the second fridge in the garage. And you need to pay to run all of them, forever. I added it up for my own house, and it made me sick. Refrigeration alone is one of the biggest single power draws in a typical Australian home, running every hour of every day, year after year. Over a lifetime, we're each handing over thousands upon thousands of dollars, just to keep things cold, when families in far harsher conditions than my air-conditioned kitchen managed it for the cost of a bit of hessian and a dish of water. That's the cost of the belief. That's what believing the lie has taken from you, quietly, every single day, while you weren't looking. But cold food is just one thread. Once I pulled it, the whole jumper started to unravel. Because the next thing I had to face was even harder to swallow. It wasn't just that we'd been sold expensive replacements for cheap methods. It was that the expensive replacements were often worse. Let me give you food preserving, because this one genuinely shocked me. We've been trained to believe fresh from the shop is the gold standard, and that anything preserved at home is a poor, old-fashioned substitute. Backwards again. In 1915, a Melbourne man named Joseph Fowler started what became Fowlers Vacola, and he put reliable home bottling into ordinary Australian kitchens. For generations, families would put up the summer glut, peaches, tomatoes, apricots, plums, into glass jars that sat on a shelf and fed them right through winter. No power, no ongoing cost, no dependence on a supply chain that can fail, or a price that only ever goes up. Now here's the part that stings. That preserved fruit, put up in season at the peak of ripeness, was often more nutritious than the so-called fresh fruit we buy today. Because a lot of what sits in the shop was picked green, shipped for days or weeks, gassed to color up, and has been slowly losing its goodness the whole time. The old girl bottling her own peaches in February was locking in the nutrition at the exact moment it was highest. We were taught to look down on that. We were fools to. I started doing the sums on what a household actually spends replacing these buried skills with bought convenience, and the figure frightened me. Between the power to run multiple fridges and freezers, the premium we pay for out-of-season produce trucked across the country, the packaged foods that are just preserved foods someone else made and marked up, and the endless replacing of things we could once mend, a typical family is bleeding thousands of dollars a year, every year, for the privilege of not knowing what their grandparents knew for free. And that money doesn't just vanish. For a lot of households it goes onto a card, which means you're not just paying the premium, you're paying interest on the premium. You are, quite literally, going into debt to avoid using knowledge that was once considered basic common sense. That's the trap. That's the machine. You forget the old way, so you buy the new way, and because the new way is dear, you borrow to afford it, and the borrowing keeps you chained to the income that keeps you too busy and too tired to ever relearn the old way. Round and round it goes. I was deep in that machine, and I want to tell you the exact moment I decided to climb out, because it might be the same moment you're having right now, watching this. Now, I know what a lot of you are thinking at this point, and it's a fair thought. You're thinking, that's all lovely for people with a backyard, or a farm, or a spare shed and 40 acres. But I'm in a unit. I rent. I've got one window that opens, and a balcony the size of a doormat. This bloke's nostalgia is no use to me. I want to talk straight to you for a minute, because you are exactly the person I made this for. Here's the truth that took me too long to understand. None of the best old methods actually needed land. We just assume they did because we picture the farm. But the families using this knowledge most intensely weren't always on big properties. They were miners in tents. They were workers in tiny terrace houses in the inner city, with a yard you could barely swing a cat in. They were people in exactly your situation, with less space and less money than you have right now, and they still fed themselves well and kept their costs on the floor. So let me give you something you can do this week, in the home you're in, with no landlord's permission and no tradesman. Start with your windows and your airflow, because staying comfortable is one of the biggest costs you've got, and the old way of managing it costs nothing. Before air conditioning, people cooled their homes by understanding how air moves. In the cool of early morning, you open up and let the night air that's settled inside stay trapped. You close the house up before the heat of the day, pull the blinds or hang a damp sheet across the sunniest window, and you keep that morning coolness locked in for hours. In the evening, when the outside air finally drops below the inside temperature, you open everything on opposite sides of your place to pull a cross breeze straight through. I tested this in a mate's brick flat that used to cook like an oven. Just by managing the openings and the light with the rhythm of the day, the way people did before we had a switch on the wall. He knocked the worst of the heat off without touching the cooler for most of the summer. That's real money, back in your pocket, in a rented flat, this week. Now do the same thinking with your food. You do not need a garden to grow the things that cost you the most at the checkout. The most expensive stuff per gram in your trolley is fresh herbs and salad greens, and they're the easiest things in the world to grow on a windowsill or that doormat balcony. A cut-and-come-again lettuce, a pot of parsley, some spring onions you regrow from the roots you'd normally throw out. That's produce that never wilts in your crisper because you pick it the moment you need it. Small, yes, but it's the exact same principle the miners used. Produce what you can, where you are, with what you've got. And here's the one that connects straight to the secret I've been promising you. You can preserve food in a flat as easily as on a farm. A batch of jam, a jar of pickles, a few bottles of stewed fruit bought cheap when it's in glut and going off at the market. That's a pantry that feeds you when prices spike, and it takes a pot and a stove and an afternoon. No land, no shed, no excuse. I want you to hear that clearly, because the whole lie depends on you believing this is for someone else. It was never for someone else. It was for people exactly like you, and it still is. Picture yourself standing at your own bench this weekend, a wet sheet draped over a shelf by the window, feeling cool air come off it with your bare hand, and knowing you paid nothing to make it. That is exactly the feeling I've put into the collection I wrote for people in your shoes. Aussie Basics, Deep Thrift, and the full system. They walk you step by step through building the old Coolgardie safe method from things already in your kitchen. Setting up a pantry so eggs and butter stop spoiling before you use them. Cutting that humming fridge's round-the-clock drain without buying a single new appliance. And cooking warm, filling meals with almost no power. Plus printable cards and a preserving calendar you can stick right on the fridge. And here's the free test I want you to run tonight, before you spend a thing. Drape a damp cloth over any shelf near an open window. Sit the bottom edges in a tray of water. Stand it in a breeze. and feel for yourself how the inside goes cooler than the room. That's the whole secret. Working for free, in your hands. If that little test opens your eyes, then get the full method, because the fastest way to get the books is to scan the QR code right there on your screen, or go to the link in the description or the pinned comment. Your fridge is running and costing you every single hour whether you use this knowledge or not, so there's no reason to wait. And here's the one that connects straight to the secret I've been promising you. Now you're ready for the thing I found in my uncle's shed. So now you're ready for the thing I found in my uncle's shed. The thing I nearly threw away. The buried piece of Australian know-how that ties all of this together and proves, beyond argument, that you have never needed money or power or debt to live well. Let me take you back to Coolgardie, Western Australia, in the middle of the 1890s. Gold had been struck there in 1892, and thousands of people poured into one of the hottest, driest, most brutal places on the continent. Temperatures well over 40 degrees. No river, no ice, and certainly no electricity. Refrigeration in the home was still decades away from ordinary people. These were folk living in tents and tin humpies in a furnace, and they had a problem that could kill them. How do you keep meat, milk, and butter from rotting in that heat, when a single bad feed could put you in the ground? A worker there, a man remembered as Arthur Patrick McCormick, worked out the answer. And it's so simple, so cheap, and so clever that when I finally understood it, I sat down on my uncle's shed floor and laughed out loud at how badly we'd all been robbed. He built a cabinet with a frame and shelves, and he draped the whole thing in hessian, plain, cheap cloth. On the top he sat a tray of water, and he ran strips of that cloth up from the tray so the water was constantly wicking up and soaking down through the hessian, keeping it wet all day. Then he stood the whole thing where the breeze could reach it, up off the ground, often on the shady side of the dwelling. Here's the science, and this is the bit they never bothered to teach us. When water evaporates, it takes heat with it. It's the exact same reason you feel cold stepping out of the surf into a breeze. The water leaving your skin is dragging the heat out of you. As the dry desert air blew through that wet hessian, it pulled the moisture out of the cloth, and every bit of moisture that left carried heat away with it. The inside of that cabinet dropped well below the scorching air outside, cool enough to keep milk sweet, butter firm, and meat safe, for days, in the middle of a Western Australian summer, using nothing but cloth, water, and moving air. They called it the Coolgardie Safe, and within a few years it had spread right across the country. It became a standard fixture in Australian homes, on verandas and in cool rooms and out the back of kitchens, from the goldfields to the cities, for the better part of half a century. My uncle's generation grew up with these. They were as normal as a kettle, and then the electric fridge came, and the marketing came with it, and within a generation this brilliant, free, no-power food keeper was recast as a sad relic of hard times and swept into the tip. That's the buried document, if you like. Not a piece of paper, but a whole proven technology, recorded in the newspapers and records of the West Australian goldfields of the 1890s, tested by tens of thousands of families in the harshest conditions this country can throw at you, and then quietly erased because it made us too hard to sell to. And here's why I'm giving it to you today. Because this is the part that matters. You can build a Coolgardie safe this weekend, and you do not need a shed or a farm or a single tool you don't already own. Let me tell you exactly how. Take any open frame, an old wire shelf, a wooden crate stood on end, even a cheap set of metal shelves. Sit it in a tray or a baking dish that holds water. Drape it all over with cloth, an old cotton sheet, a length of hessian, a couple of towels, whatever breathes and holds water. Make sure the bottom edges of the cloth sit down in the tray so the water wicks up and keeps the whole lot damp. Then stand it somewhere a breeze passes through. Near an open window is perfect. In front of a fan if there's no breeze that day. Not in direct sun. Keep water in the tray. That's it. That's the entire secret. The evaporation does the work for free, day and night. for the price of the cloth and a jug of water. Now, I'm not going to insult you and say throw your fridge in the bin, but I will tell you what my uncle's box taught me once I built my own. There is a whole category of things we've been trained to refrigerate that don't need it, and were never refrigerated for most of human history. Root vegetables, plenty of fruit, eggs, hard cheese, butter for the week, condiments, bread. Move that lot into a well-made cool safe by an open window, and you take a serious bite out of the load on your fridge, or you free yourself from needing that second garage fridge that's been quietly eating $20 or $30 a month for years. In a blackout, when everyone else's food is spoiling, yours sits safe on the bench exactly the way the Goldfields families intended. I ran mine through a heat wave last summer, sitting by the laundry window, and the inside stayed markedly cooler than the room around it, day after day, without me touching a switch or paying a cent. I stood there, feeling that cool air off a damp sheet, thinking about a bloke sweating in a tin Humpy in Coolgardie 130 years ago, who worked this out with nothing, and I felt something close to grief for everything we threw away. Because that's the whole con, laid bare. Everything we've been told we must buy and plug in and borrow to afford, our great-grandparents did better, cheaper, and cleaner, with knowledge that cost nothing to pass on and nothing to use. They didn't live well in spite of having no money. They lived well because they were never dependent on it in the first place. The debt, the bills, the endless paying, that's not the price of living well. That's the price of forgetting how. And you've just stopped forgetting. That's what I want you to feel right now, more than any single tip. Not that you've learned a clever trick with a wet sheet, but that you've just taken back something that was stolen from you. The plain, powerful knowledge that a good life was never something you had to buy on credit. It was always something you could build with your own hands, in the home you already have, starting this weekend. Because here's who you really are, and I think you've known it the whole time you've been watching. You are not a customer to be managed and marketed to and kept just dependent enough to keep paying. You're the kind of person who wants to look at a bill, or a shelf, or a shed full of old gear, and understand how things actually work. The kind who'd rather know the truth and do it yourself than be sold the expensive version of a simple thing for the rest of your life. That instinct you've got, the one that made you click on this in the first place, that's not nostalgia. That's your good sense trying to get your attention. So let me ask you something, and I genuinely want your answer. When you were a kid, or when you visited the older folks in your family, did you ever see one of these food safes, the hessian box, the meat safe with the wet cloth, the cool cupboard by the window? What did your people call it, and where in the country were you when you saw it? Tell me in the comments below. I read them, and I want to know how far this knowledge spread, and how many of you have one sitting in a memory you'd half forgotten. Say where you're watching from while you're at it. I'm always amazed at how wide this reaches. And if something in you tightened up when I explained how deliberately this stuff was buried, then you belong here. Subscribe and stand with the rest of us who've decided we're done believing the convenient lie, the crowd who'd rather recover what worked than keep renting it back at a markup. This isn't a channel. It's a room full of people quietly taking their independence back, one forgotten method at a time. Because next I'm going to show you the old way Australians kept their homes warm through a frost for almost nothing, a heating trick from the settler cottages that the power companies would very much prefer you never rediscover, tied to a method recorded long before anyone had a switch on the wall. You've been paying to stay warm the expensive way your whole life. Wait until you see what they did instead. I believed the lie for 40 years. Don't give it another 40. Build the safe this weekend. Feel that cool air off a wet sheet with your own hand, and you'll never quite trust the expensive version of anything again. Before you go, let me tell you where this leads. This video showed the idea, but inside I walk you through the full bush icebox build, every step. If you get stuck, ask me directly. A real person, me, answers you myself. You won't be alone either. Folks like you are already inside the Bush Wisdom Circle. Just point your phone's camera at the code on screen. Cancel anytime with one click.